Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on the recently added Variant and Criterion dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV. I've gotten intimately familiar with them over the past week and have a lot to say about them, so we should probably get started on this video sooner rather than later. I'm going to be doing a lot of this off the top of my head, as I tend to. Quick little warning though, if you're someone who's trying to stay in the dark about everything, I'm not going to be going over the lore too much, but I am going to be showing footage of all of the bosses at Variant at some point or another, and of course Criterion stuff as well. So if you don't want to see any of that, then just click away from the video right now. So for those of you who maybe don't keep up with everything Final Fantasy XIV, maybe you're not playing right now and you just caught this video on YouTube and you want to see what's going on, Variant and Criterion dungeons are a new style of content added in patch 6.25. Variant dungeons have branching paths with different enemies and bosses and a lore and a story that evolves over every time you play it. You might obtain a hint from one time when you play it and go and find another ending someplace else. So it's meant to be done over and over until you've uncovered all the different lore. It allows you to do the dungeon completely solo and even gives you bonus actions to make sure that you can take that on regardless of which job you're actually playing. Criterion dungeons, on the other hand, are a more structured version of the Variant dungeons and more difficult. You have to go in with a balanced party of 4 players. All of the bosses and paths are always exactly the same. There's only one path, same enemy, same everything every time you do it, and it's a great deal harder. Something between an extreme trial and a savage raid. On top of that, deaths are heavily penalized as you're only able to use a single variant action, unlike all the ones you had before, and that is the raise, as traditional resurrection methods don't work. Going into Savage, those are actually made even tougher, as yes, there is a difficulty above just Criterion. There, you're not allowed to res for the whole dungeon. If everyone wipes at any point, the entire dungeon resets and you have to do the whole thing over again. And on top of that, the health and damage of everything inside is significantly tougher. Not to mention, a hard enrage from the first trash pull all the way to the final boss of only 24 minutes. Yeah, in other words, they're just very different dungeons from the way that we've had them in Final Fantasy XIV in the past. And given this is the first one, I think it's, well, worth talking about for a little bit. So first I want to start with the Variant dungeons. Now this is the casual mode dungeon. You can do them solo if you want. You can do them with a few friends. You can even change jobs when you're inside if you're not really feeling your first choice, or if you queue in and you just think that maybe something would help the team out a little bit more. The bonus actions go an extra way to ensure that there's really no way to screw this up. You know, you could get hit by stuff, you could just not use your actions, forget to do them, but they've given you every tool imaginable to make this a smooth experience. It even scales depending on the number of people that you actually enter with. But really the big thing about the dungeon is that it is the most dungeon-like dungeon that Final Fantasy XIV has had in a while. At the start, you'll pick one of 3 paths. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you're escorting little Nanamo here, who I'll talk about a little bit more later on. But once you've selected a path, that will put you on kind of a one-track mind. You know what kind of bosses you're going to see at that point, but there are little decisions along the way that can adjust the mechanics those bosses have and the way that you have to fight them. It's a really neat way of doing things because realistically, unless you're trying to speed run the fastest path or something like that, every time you do this dungeon, there's going to be a slightly different experience. And your first time through, you're going to be curious about what all of those different experiences will actually be. It's a really, really well done dungeon. And quite frankly, by the time I was done doing the 12 different paths that this one has, I kind of just wish this was how all dungeons were. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a big dungeoneer in Final Fantasy XIV as a whole. I really only do them as a last resort, or if I just find I need an infusion of tomes in a really short period of time, and there's no hunts going on. With that being said, if I'm not going to be super into the dungeons, I'd rather still have the best version of those dungeons I can have. And this really feels like what most people criticize Final Fantasy XIV for not having. All of Final Fantasy XIV standard dungeons are trash boss, and while this isn't inherently different, the different styles, paths, and bosses that you'll encounter on any given run make it a much more variable experience, a lot less static and a little bit less tedious and boring, like some of the other dungeons may be. I was really enjoying going through, reading all of the text dialogue, finding the little secrets on the ground, and while I did use a cheat sheet to get all 12 of the endings, as I was doing it several days later after it had actually come out, that didn't really change my enjoyment of it at all. It was still fun to go through every time just to pick out those little tiny differences. Sometimes there are differences that you can't even influence. You go down a different path and get a different set of trash mobs than you did the time before. And I think that's a really good balance of things to have, even if it sometimes makes getting the mapping achievement achievement. A little bit annoying. I got lucky and got it done in 12 runs, but I know people who are much less fortunate than I. Going down the left path, the middle path, or the right path, the first boss is always a Gigas. Now this Gigas has generally the same mechanics regardless of which path you get, but depending on what you do on each of those paths, one of those mechanics will be different. One of them has wind turbines that pull you towards them. One of them has these rocks that kind of slide through the arena while you're also dodging other mechanics. One of them has back and forth water pulses that explode you have to avoid. Some of them leave puddles behind, which is a very interesting one to actually trigger. In the right path, if you didn't know this, killing the Morbol first when you get to that point will actually cause the ceruleum thing to happen. I know some people are probably wondering how that actually gets triggered. And then the middle path, I don't really remember the mechanics for that one off the top of my head too well, but the point is that they will be different every time, even if the first boss is exactly the same. The final boss at the end of each path is a completely different boss, though, with completely different mechanics, and there's even 4 different variations of what that boss can do. Basically, the decisions you make between the first boss and the second boss will affect the ending you get. You'll obtain a lore entry, and the mechanics for the boss will actually change. It's a really, really cool thing to see, and it's something that just feels more natural of an experience. You don't always understand why these things change the boss or change the lore, but that doesn't really matter in the end. It's just something being different is a really, really welcome feeling in Final Fantasy XIV after all of these years. Not to mention, the secret 12th path is very, very cryptic in order to find it. While all the information is in the game, the dungeon gives you hints on how to find the additional paths as you're making the different decisions going through. It's very cryptic to find, but when you do, it unlocks the true secret final boss. And I gotta say, I love that. Having all of these different bosses, all these different experiences, and being so variable, hence the name Variant, is just a really, really welcome experience. I can't really criticize it all that much. Normally, I can find something like, it's just a dungeon, whatever. But something was different about this. I really do wish that they expand upon this and bring it to more parts of the game. Heck, I'd be okay if they replaced all of our dungeons with variant equivalents in every MSQ, but I understand that's probably not a realistic thing. We do know that we're supposed to be getting 2 more variant dungeons in 6.45 and 6.55, and I gotta say, not only am I excited for those, but I really hope they make a variant dungeon roulette. I don't care if they even have to make some sort of contingency with that. Like maybe they decide that, we don't want to make it a roulette because if people pick different paths, they're going to fight over it. If you're that concerned about that, you could just make it so it chooses a path for you when you queue in, when you're using the roulette, but it's still a different path every time. It's still a different experience every time, even if the player doesn't actually have the choice. Because I do think that people would fight over, go this path, it's like 30 seconds faster. People are petty like that, and it's just a little failsafe they could do. And not to mention, you could still run it solo if you wanted to do all those different paths, and it really doesn't take that long when you do it alone. I think it took me like 13 minutes-ish on Monk the first time I went through each of the different paths, so that's not bad at all. And it gives tomes, so it already does everything a normal dungeon does. It's just better. What else can you ask for in Final Fantasy XIV? Not to mention that instead of giving traditional loot, it has a couple of other things in there. For one, it's got fireworks, which whoop-de-doo, but more importantly, it has a number of minions, it has mounts, it has all sorts of stuff you can find. Well, I say mounts, I think you can actually find one of the Criterion items in there, and Criterion we'll talk about in a little bit, but I'm going to need a source on that, because I've only heard you can get the mount from a chest. I don't know if that's only the Criterion chest or not, as I've not had it happen myself. But there are different minions, and you also get a currency that allows you to go to an NPC and purchase things that can be glammed and sold, and I don't know. I just think it's good, especially if you're going to make a dungeon not give gear. I think this is the right way to go about it, at least for the variant one. But, as long as you make the rewards okay and the experience good, then it's something that I'd like to be involved with more in the future. I'm curious to see if this goes in a better direction or a worse direction when we get the next one in 6.45. Then we bump up to Criterion. Now, Criterion dungeons were described to us as a more difficult experience. I already went over the rules with you earlier, but it is essentially an extreme and or savage equivalent of a dungeon. The trash mobs are very, very dangerous, much more than we expected them to be when we first queued in. We noticed that they could nearly two-shot any player they hit with an AoE, and on top of that, they hit pretty hard. Not too hard on the normal difficulty, but we definitely were like, okay, this is, they're taking this seriously a little bit. it's pretty easy to just get caught up in the fact that you're killing trash, not dodge something because the AoE doesn't appear till later, and realize you've just gotten yourself slapped up. Not to mention the fact that you can't resurrect outside of using that variant raise action in combat is, well, you know, you learn to appreciate that one res that you do get occasionally, but you also learn that sometimes it's just not enough to save everything. Moving on to the first boss, and actually I'll talk about all of the bosses briefly. All of the bosses are the final bosses from the left, middle, and right path in Variant. So once you've done the 3 base bosses there and all of their different paths, you have a much better idea of how these bosses are going to perform, and I really like that. It made it great for me, someone who went right from normal into Savage without doing all the paths, as I got to do a bunch of things I didn't recognize at their most difficult. So it was a lot better of a blind prog for me doing this more difficult dungeon, just because I rushed to the end of it. But a more casual player looking to try out the Criterion dungeons for the first time, who may have taken their time with Variant and recognized all the mechanics, might have an easier time learning. So it's balanced really well for the different types of experiences that a player goes in wanting. And that kind of flexibility doesn't really happen in traditional Savage or Ultimate content. When us hardcore raiders go to that stuff, we beat the normal mode into the ground if we have the time, especially now that there's a delay before Savage comes out. And for Ultimate, we go back and dissect all the different mechanics and try to figure out how could they combine this and that and what are we going to see. We are very pragmatic about it, but here we didn't have a chance to be. And people have said that that's a reason why we shouldn't have that 1 week delay for Savage, but here they came out at the same time and we still got to have that experience. Heck, I went down the right path and that didn't felt like it helped me with the final boss at all. I didn't retain enough to actually feel like that information was even useful going from normal into, or going from Variant into Criterion. So really, really solid experience right off the bat. Now, the first boss, Sil'dihn, really caught most people by surprise. I think when we all thought of difficult 4-man content, we really considered the limits of what the dev team could actually do with that. There couldn't be any tank swaps, you needed to be able to do it with any healer, and while you could do a DPS check, it still had to be something a little more reasonable for 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS to take on. I said it before it came out, and it kind of ended up being true. The only thing they could really do is puzzle mechanics. A lot of mechanics that are intensive when figuring them out, but have very specific ways of solving them. And thus, progging them is very difficult, or more difficult than one might expect, but repeating them isn't. And so that is kind of what we got here. They did actually manage, even with Sil'dihn, to make some stuff that's relatively execution specific, especially towards the end with the final mechanic, but they just did a good job with this across the board, especially having not seen Sil'dihn in Variant before coming here. I didn't understand what the different brooms did. I didn't understand what the attack names meant because I didn't have a point of reference from not doing the other one. So I was stumped, and I was glad I was stumped because I went in thinking probably roll this over in like 6 hours or something, and it didn't take that long, or it took longer than that, but it didn't take that long. But at the same time, it was just a good experience. This is a boss that really does push the edge of what 4-man content can be, or at the very least begins to push to that edge, because a little bit later it actually goes to the edge of what 4-man content could possibly be. So Sil'dihn here, really good start, a lot of very particular movements, and a lot of really great ways to optimize the strategies, especially with only 4 people. Again, really, really impressed with what they pulled off here. But honestly, I think the most impressive thing is the second trash pull. It's just this room with 4 patrolling mobs. They're all incredibly dangerous, and they even kind of counteract each other. If you were to pull one of each at a time, you'd probably just die outright. 1 armor, 1 Dullahan fighting it at the same time. You could survive, but it's not going to be a great scenario for you, and that's only exacerbated on the Savage difficulty. This is the kind of stuff that I would love to see from Trash more often, and I think when people talk about the game having more interesting trash, these are the kind of things they're talking about. It's not just that the trash needs to hit harder or not have AoE markers or anything like that. The room itself with the trash is a mechanic. You have to clear all the mobs out. They're all patrolling all the time on a very set pattern, and they're too dangerous to fight more than one at a time. So you might have to sneak around, get behind, especially when you don't understand the movements of the enemies all that much yet. And that engagement with the actual map, with the room, and with the enemies and their attacks is just a welcome addition of Final Fantasy XIV. We very rarely see this, even inside of other difficult kind of off the beaten path content like Delubrum Regine Savage. The trash itself was a bunch of mini bosses other than the very first trash pull, which was more puzzly and interactive like I'm describing here. So every time they do this, I feel like they do knock it out of the park, and I'm glad to see that, and I hope that this is a sign of things to come. Now on to the second boss, the Gladiator. Boy, you know, Silky was one thing. When I went back and did variant for Silky, I was like, oh, okay, this explains it. I would have gotten this much quicker. But for the second boss, well, the second boss was easier in some capacity than the first boss. It was also a boss I think I would have appreciated doing on normal mode first more than the first boss, because a lot of the visuals and the way that they're presented are very specific to this boss and its mechanics, and the extra visuals you get to describe what they do in normal mode really, really help out. It didn't take too long to figure it out otherwise, but that, again, that little extra step, I love that the information is just so valuable going from normal, or going from variant into normal. Sorry, I gotta get used to not calling the variant modes normal when it's variant, Criterion normal, Criterion Savage. So I think everyone's been kind of making that mistake since it came out. It's a very weird naming convention, I'll be honest. But this boss was a lot about very specific movements and reading debuffs, and it was very different from Silky, which was all about positioning the boss and how the boss interacted with its own mechanics. This one is a lot about how the players interact with the boss more so. What do our debuffs mean? Where we position? What do these different pulsing AoEs that can be different sizes actually mean for our positioning? Again, just a very different feeling, even if I think this boss is a little bit easier. It's easier to understand, it's easier to execute, and yeah, I don't know. I don't really have too much to say about the second boss. It's an okay boss. This is kind of like what I would have expected going into 4-man content, more so than the first and the third boss, which again, I feel like excel at showing what the limits of 4-man content can actually be. Then you go right into the final boss, and that's a boss. This boss is puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. 5 different puzzles that you have to solve within the roughly 5 minutes and 45 seconds you have before the enrage, and all of them are very, very engaging. Some of them eventually get dumbed down into very, very simple executions, but even still, the visual overload, the amount of effects, the amount of things that are overlapping, was a little frustrating at first. You know, I'm somebody who is colorblind, and while that doesn't necessarily mean I can't see the difference between things all the time, it means when there's a lot of overlapping effects that sometimes my brain has to kind of kick it into overdrive to differentiate everything, and that can be a little bit discouraging. I felt that way at first, but it just means that my eyes need longer to adjust. And once you got it down, there's a lot of very simple ways to rationalize this boss, like there is for pretty much every puzzle boss. But it is such a demanding fight in terms of your level of consistency, your ability to actually perform the mechanics without messing them up, the punishment for doing them wrong. It is a very, very exacting fight, and is going to be a difficult prog point for people who are less experienced with raids, or maybe just not used to these styles of content, or not used to having so few people in order to solve mechanics like this. The first mechanic is just orbs that rotate, and you have to find safe spots while being spread out. Nothing too crazy, and then eventually it comes down to blocking AoEs. You know, people who don't get hit by one attack have to block the attack for somebody else. Those are all very fundamental things for extreme, savage, that level of content. But from that point on, it really kicks it into gear. You have these tripwires that you need to resolve by disarming them in the order that they appear numerically. So you need to set up the room, or set up the players in the room, so that they can break all of the wires. But then you also need to see, do I need to break the horizontal wires first or the vertical wires first, so I can dodge these other AoEs that are coming out. Then another set of AoEs comes out while you're trying to break the second set, and it's just so very involved and exact and satisfying. It's one of those mechanics that when you do it right, it just looks pretty. You know, sometimes it's not even about how difficult it is, it's about how it looks when you do it right. And this is one of those that just, chef's kiss. I'm going to dread when those tripwires show up in 8-man raids. Looking towards Omega Ultimate, where we're going to have to do Hello World while also doing tripwires or something like that. I mean, would you be surprised? I know I wouldn't be. Anyway, then you have these portal mechanics. There's portals that rotate, and the player has portals that rotate, and there's baited AoEs. We have broken that down to a very, very simple way to solve it. So many very simple ways, actually. I know I did East Portals North west portal south, and then clockwise would teleport out first and counterclockwise would teleport in first. I did it with the party finder earlier, and they would send both clockwise as north, both counterclockwise as south, and then it was just a matter of whether you were in or out, you know, depending on what portal you had. Like east portal had to go from in to out, and west portal had to go from out to in. So many simple ways to begin rationalizing it that sounds like just utter garbage coming out of your mouth when you describe it to somebody, as you no doubt just learned right now. But still, the way that it looks and the way that it's performed and the satisfaction of doing it correct is very high. And the learning process for this was something that was a bit overwhelming at first. It's just so many effects and so many different elements to take into consideration that reducing it down to its barest of elements really did a lot for improving the prog here. The fourth mechanic involves portals that also rotate, probably the easiest mechanic other than the very first brand. It's just a matter of understanding what the maximum possibilities are for these portals, understanding how the horizontal ones can rotate and the vertical one can rotate, and finding these 4 safe squares that you can actually go to. And, you know, it's okay, it works out. A lot of people even screw this one up and just survive, because, you know, as long as you don't knock each other into the wall with the jump attack, then you should be okay. But you know, it's still, it's fine. It's fine for a mechanic. It's one of those like, oh, I get why that's here, but also, you know, not one of the more thrilling ones. Then the final one is just massive tripwire. Very easy to solve, but very execution heavy. You got to have 1-2 break the wires, then 3-4 bait the AoEs, then 3-4 break the wires, then 1-2 break the AoEs. Then you got to bait these AoEs. After you bait the AoEs, 1-2 break the wires, 3-4 do the baits, dodge other AoEs, 3-4 breaks the wires, 1-2 does the baits. You're done. That's what it boils down to, but it looks crazy on the screen. And again, very satisfying to pull off. This was a boss I loved progging, and everyone I've spoken to has really enjoyed this boss in particular. It makes me wonder what they really do going forward, because these style of mechanics are, now that this is my point of reference, you know, I almost have a hard time imagining too many other 4-player mechanics that aren't more like the first boss, you know, where there's certain things you need to interact with and aim AoEs in a specific direction in order to trigger certain effects. That is more of what I expected than something that was so exacting like this. Because if you screw up any of those tripwires, if you screw any part of some of these mechanics up, it becomes nigh on unrecoverable, even on the normal difficulty, where you can still use the variant raises to save people if 1 or 2 people go down. Not to mention, you know, there are still tank busters, room wides across all these bosses, and they all hurt. They are not weak AoEs. These are not weak bosses. Even if we can kill them pretty quick on normal mode with all the gear that we have, that doesn't change anything. They're still very well balanced bosses. I also have to give them credit, speaking of balance, to something else that they did. They made it so that jobs that normally provide lots of raid buffs and are balanced around providing raid buffs in groups of 8 people, if those jobs are present, your entire group gets an invisible damage adjustment. You know, you would probably notice it depending on what your job composition is going in if you compared it from one run to the other. But it's a nice way of making it so that people don't perceive certain jobs as weak because you don't have 8 players and they aren't able to provide as many buffs. I loved the different jobs that I saw people using, and jobs that we never see people using in lower in higher end content traditionally, making appearances and even going through to get really early clears, like Machinist, which gets dogged on pretty heavily, and rightfully so. Fingers crossed for those buffs November 1st. But this was fantastic. The only thing kind of is the reward structure, and I'll talk about this more with the Savage difficulty, but every time you clear, you get 4 coins, and then you have a chance of getting the rewards that you would otherwise purchase with coins. The only thing you can spend the coins on is a mount, a throne, the Sil'dihn throne, or I think it's a music sheet that has the music that you listen to while you're going through the dungeon. That's kind of been the biggest crux that most people have been discussing. And I'll touch upon that after I talk about the Savage rewards as well, because that's an even bigger point that people are talking about. But the actual content going through was fantastic, and I really hope they can deliver a similar or better experience going into 6.45. Same with the variant, but also especially with the Criterion. Oh, another disappointing thing with Criterion, and this leads into my Savage discussion, is that the secret 12th path boss from Variant doesn't make an appearance at all. Now, while I didn't see him in normal mode, and I was like, okay, they would probably save him for Savage, when I started going through Savage, we very quickly found out that Savage is all the normal mode fights, but just way stricter. You know, all those restrictions I mentioned at the start of the video, you know, there are no resurrections at all. You have to beat the whole dungeon from start to finish in under 24 minutes. with not without deaths, but you know, you can without those resurrections being available to you at all. If you wipe, you have to start the whole dungeon over. All the bosses and mobs, they have more health, they deal more damage, everything's more threatening, and so you're under this constant pressure of trying to get through the whole dungeon super quick. But all the mechanics are exactly the same. There's really no variance. Some AoE markers don't appear or appear later, but again, that's really it. And I think a lot of us were expecting new mechanics, expecting new things to show up. But I also started to hold the expectation that that bonus boss I had heard about and not seen at this point was going to be present in Savage. I mean, it makes sense, you know, just to have that boss there, but he's not there either. And to me, that's a little strange, because this boss is probably the coolest boss in normal mode also. And I was like, oh man, after I went and finally did it, after I beat Criterion Savage and went back and did Variant, I was like, man, I would have loved to have seen a Savage version of this. Why didn't we get that? And I'm kind of on copium. In fact, where is my copium? Here we go. Hold on. Let me take Okay, so because we're getting 2 more Variant and Criterion dungeons in the rest of the expansion, my copium excuse is that we're going to get an ultimate version in 6.55, and it's going to be only the secret bosses from the first 3 Criterions. That's my tinfoil hat copium theory of Endwalker. I can't wait to be wrong about it, but what if I'm right? Huh? Either way, Savage struggles with rewards as well, because you don't even get the silver from normal mode in Savage, which is mistake number 1. You should absolutely get at least the same silver, if not more, probably double. But you instead get a manuscript, which is another currency. Okay, what can you buy with that currency? 1 materia, or a banner to hang up in your house, a Sil'dihn banner, or earrings with a crown on the end. You do also get a title from clearing it the first time, but that's it. Now, again, I didn't do this content for the rewards. I don't even use most of my ultimate glams or titles that I get. So I clearly don't care that much about it, even if I might show off the weapon for a little bit. But that's still not good. And it might require its own video to discuss. But the fact that there's nothing else is just, it's not great. And I don't think that's going to change. I mean, they've been pretty good about taking feedback in this expansion and turning it into, I guess, tangible change, or at least acknowledged change that is coming. Great example is people said the PvP seasonal rewards are not great. You know, just that same adventure plate and portrait thing every time. So they said they're working to ramp those up. You know, they are also hiring in the departments that would work on this kind of stuff like visual effects and whatnot. So maybe they are trying to ramp up the amount of rewards that they can provide for the different content that they are trying to do. I'm not saying they are, but they might be. Yeah, that's just kind of what we're hoping. But I guess the question is, what rewards would people want? Now, talking about normal mode, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that normal mode could at least once a week reward tombstone upgrade materials. A minimum item level of 610 is required for normal mode, and that's the same as full crafted gear and the same as the final fight in the Savage tier for 8 people. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to just make that a potential reward for that. It fits completely within the item level parameters, and people who already have best in slot can use it to gear alt jobs. At the bare minimum, I'd like to see them make that adjustment, just a once a week bonus for doing Criterion, maybe in patch 6.4 and 6.5. But other than that, I'm not really sure. I would love its own armor set, but I think that's asking for a bit much given how much other armor and stuff we tend to get in other pieces of content in the game. But I do know a lot of people would, of course, love some side grades. You know, maybe if there's one piece that's just not good for you in this raid tier or from tomes, to have that extra option. And you know what? I'm never going to say no to those things, but my realistic expectation is that we wouldn't ever receive anything like that. Now for Savage, at the very least, Savage needs to emulate normal mode's rewards. Again, I think it's a mistake to not give silver at the very least, because it just makes the normal mode way more repeatable, makes it way more valuable. And, you know, yeah, they want the Savage mode to be there for people who particularly want a challenge, but they do want rewards for those challenges, something that fits the D that they were able to achieve. And what they have currently is not enough. Now, I don't think that the Savage version needs to reward any gear. I think you're better off putting that into Criterion Normal and then just making Savage also give one of those items. It's just the other rewards I think that really need to ramp up. Something that really says, I did this and not a lot of people have done this, because realistically, that's what draws people, a lot of people, to the ultimates. Yes, the challenge is great, but being able to have this thing that not that many other people have, or at least that you can show off and says, hey, look what I've done, is a lot better. And unfortunately, this Savage just doesn't have that reward other than the title, which is not something that is as interesting. At the very least a Savage exclusive adventure, plate, or portrait would have been welcome, but I also think not enough. I fully expected them to make the throne a Savage only reward and to put other things inside of the normal difficulty. What they're going to do, I'm really curious about, because there's no way they're missing the feedback. Again, they've been really good at acknowledging the types of feedback that they've gotten, and I hope that they address this in the next letter from the producer live. But do I think we're going to get anything crazy? No, I think at the best we get a more visual reward like a mount or something from the next one on Savage, and the normal mode maybe has some things bumped up. I also got to admit, if you want to give materia as a potential reward for the manuscript, okay, but it needs to be more than one. The fact that it's only one as an alternative to the banner or the earrings is insane to me. It should be like 50, all right? Or at the very least like 25 or 30, or more than one, and more than like 5 or 10. You know, it's just, that's not enough. It's not enough no matter who you ask. And I think it's going to discourage people from going into it later. Oh, hold on. Copium number 2. Hold on. So in 6.45 and 6.55, we're getting another variant and Criterion dungeon. I'm theorizing that those dungeons are going to be dealing with the Nimian Society as well as the Gelmoran Societies over in Lim's Elements and Gridania, respectively. As such, each of those is going to have a manuscript and probably equally as disappointing rewards. However, upon all 3 of them coming out, one of each manuscript will be purchased to buy something exclusive, which will encourage people to go back and do the old Savages if they haven't done them already, or go back and do them again. That's number 2. I hope that one comes true also. I also hope the ultimate one comes true. I just want all my theories to come true. I hope you do as well. Now, with all of that said, I do think that Variant and Criterion were a resounding success. Yes, the rewards need to be messed around with a little bit, bumped up, I should say. Not just messed around with, they need to be made better. But the fact that they can craft this kind of experience is a very welcome change to the way things normally are in Final Fantasy XIV. I loved progressing this with a group of only 4 people and trying to figure things out based on what was actually even possible with only 4 people. I thought that they did a great job of making a mix of cryptic and straightforward mechanics that were execution tight, and that's exactly what I want out of my normal Savage raid tiers, even my ultimate tiers. Not to mention Savage having that 24-minute consistency check, I think is one of the best things they've ever added into the game, functionally. A lot of newer players don't have an easier content to practice mass amounts of consistency in. And the Criterion Savage, well, if I was somebody trying to tell a new player to learn how to be more consistent with mechanics, that's the place I would point them. Not an old ultimate, not a current ultimate, not even the current Savage tier. While yes, you can learn all of those things in there, they're a bit more stressful for the average player. And I'm not saying this isn't stressful, because obviously the death means you start all the way over. But if somebody can get 5 minutes into Criterion without dying, 10 minutes into Criterion, 15 minutes in, 20 minutes in, clear it, and they have that natural progression, it's teaching them just general consistency at a more accessible level. And I think that's something Final Fantasy XIV needs more of as a whole, is content that builds up the skills you need for endgame and doesn't just get you to endgame. So they got kudos for me from that, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect and can probably still use some adjustment. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap for me for my thoughts on Variant and Criterion. Let me know if you enjoyed the Variant and or Criterion content that we got, what your thoughts are on the actual content, the combat, as well as the reward structure. Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care.